sessions. But essentially, Michelle and many other analysts in the storage space are predicting continued growth for NVMe, continued growth for PCIe storage. So with that growth, the NVMe community recognizes the need to demonstrate the interoperability of NVMe, and these Plugfests are an important part of doing that. So in order to support that, UNH-IOL and the NVMe Express organization have been working together for nearly 3 years now. It was 2012 when we first started working together to define test requirements, start to put together test tools, launch the NVMe integrators list, and hold events like this Plugfest that we're having in June 8th, 2015. Now, I've referred to the integrators list a few times, and really the purpose of all of our testing, the end goal of all this testing that we do, whether it's in the lab, whether it's at Plugfests like this, is to prepare devices to get onto the NVMe integrators list. So here's a little screenshot of it that we took just last week, April 30th. Hasn't changed since then. But you can go anytime. You've got the link there at the bottom if you want to see what kind of products are there on the integrators list. And you can see in the screenshot that I'm sharing here, there's a table there at the bottom. It's got the list of the products in it. And then above that, it says NVMe Integrators List version 1.1b, and then the list for the policy document for Integrators List version 1.1b. All the devices that are listed here today were tested according to version 1.1b, which was the Plugfest that we had in November of 2014, so just a few months ago. After this June Plugfest, we're going to put a table below where it says NVMe Integrators List version 1.2. And that's going to list all the products that are tested at this upcoming Plugfest and thereafter. So you may have been confused seeing those two headings there, but for the time being, there's just a placeholder for the next version of the integrators list that's coming out. So with this integrators list, our purpose for it is for that to be a resource showing what products have demonstrated conformance and demonstrated interoperability to a test metric that's been defined by the community. The test procedures that we use have been reviewed by NVMe organization, people that are implementing and designing NVMe devices. It's gone through a public review process. So be sure that the tests that we're going to be running, you can view them as an industry standard, something that is accepted in the industry. And we're starting to see that OEMs are viewing this integrators list almost as a bar for components that they want to include in their systems. They want to have this as a baseline, that if a product can demonstrate conformance and interoperability enough to be on this integrators list, then it meets the qualification necessary to be included in an OEM's system. So this is something that we're seeing OEMs attach increasing importance to. Aside from those things, of course, we want to ensure that NVMe as a technology itself is robust and that it's reliable. So we hope our testing accomplishes that. So that's proving the technology as a whole being viable. In addition to that, we want to help companies that are working directly with us, folks that are attending the Plugfest, prove that their products are reliable, are conformant, and interoperable, and then also provide some recognition for that. And so the integrators list serves those three goals. How do we decide what actually ends up on the integrators list? Well, as I alluded to before, the interop and conformance test requirements are approved by the NVMe Promoters Group, discussed, and we've been discussing those since the previous Plugfest about what kind of things we want to add to the program. And then we use the Plugfest as the opportunity to launch the new requirements, the first opportunity to test against these new requirements. And I'll talk about what some of those new requirements are today. And then after the Plugfest, companies can continue to come back to UNH-IOL either with new products. If they weren't able to attend the Plugfest, they can come in with a product for the first time and test against those now new requirements. And that'll go on throughout the year. So that's just a little overview of the goals of the program. Not a whole lot of change there if you had attended one of these webinars before. So we'll get into now some of the actual components and logistics of the Plugfest. Of course, it's going to be June 8th through 11th, 2015 here in New Hampshire. I'm very happy that we chose this time of year to come to New Hampshire. Our Plugfest number 3 was in November. Plugfest number 2 was in February. Those are difficult times to be here in the frozen northeast part of the United States. But the second week of June, hopefully it'll be lovely weather. And if you're able, maybe spend a little extra time. It's a nice place to be in the summer. So we're happy about that. Good time for that. And I will also mention that the NVMe Promoters Group is hoping this will be an annual occurrence, the Plugfest, to be in about the second week of June. So you can plan on that over the next couple years. At the event, we're going to be focusing on 2 test plans. One is our interoperability test suite. One is our conformance test suite. These 2 documents describe in detail what the requirements are for getting a product on the integrators list. It also describes how to do that testing. It tells you what kind of tools you need, how to do the setups, what the observable results are. So I'd recommend that everybody go through these documents ahead of the event, be familiar with each of the various tests. And we've tried to set this up so that you can perform these tests on your own, in your own lab at home. So the conformance test tools, that's something that's available to consortium members. So you can set those up in your own lab and run them, just as we would do here at UNH-IOL. And then the interoperability tests, generally the tools for those are freely available. With the addition of the hot plug tools, or the hot plug test, there are some hardware test tools that are necessary for doing the interoperability test, and I'll discuss those in a little more detail later. But generally, the tools for performing the interoperability test are freely available. Now, one question that we get a lot with respect to the Plugfest is what kind of form factors you can test. I've got a chem card or an add-in card, or I've got an SFF8639 drive, or I've got an M.2 device. Can I still bring it to the Plugfest? The answer is yes. But if you have a non-chem device or a non-add-in card device, I would ask that you bring an adapter to facilitate the interop testing. So if you've got an SFF8639 device, please bring an add-in card adapter for that. Same for if you have an M.2 device, please bring an add-in card adapter for that. We're not particularly picky about what those adapters are. If you have one that you designed in-house and works great for you, fine, you can bring it. That's quite all right. If you're looking for those, the photos here on the left, I've got 2 samples of SFF8639 add-in card adapters, and you can kind of see each of them has a bracket for putting in an 8639 2.5-inch disk drive. On the right, an M.2 adapter, so you can see the little clip for adding in one of those gum stick style M.2 drives. The red one here is from Serial Cables. You might be familiar with that product. The green ones are from Teledynelecroy. I'm just providing those here as examples of adapters. If you have other ones that work for you or you've gotten them from another company, that's fine. I just do ask that you bring your own adapters for your products. If there's a lot of M.2 devices at the event, or there's a lot of SFF8639 devices at the event, we won't have enough adapters here to cover everybody. So just be sure to bring one that you're comfortable with, one that you trust from your own lab. Another question we get a lot about the Plugfest is how many devices should I bring? The conformance tests, we only need one device. We're going to plug it into the test system and run it. The interoperability tests, we do require 2 devices. We're going to plug 2 devices at once into the system, into the host platform that we're testing with. So we'll need at least 2 devices to do those interoperability tests. So bring at least 2 samples. If you bring more than 2 samples, you bring 3 samples or 4 samples, that may enable us to do some things in parallel and may enable us to do some things a little bit faster if the schedule allows for it. But please be sure to bring at least 2 samples. Now here's some common test terms that we use with respect to the testing in the Plugfest. Mandatory, optional, and FYI. Now mandatory, that's pretty easy to understand. The device has to pass this test if it's going to be on the integrators list. Optional, this is the one where we tend to get some more questions about. So this definition is hopefully to help clear it up a little bit. When we talk about optional tests, those are tests of features that are optional according to the NVMe specification. So if a device indicates that it supports an optional feature, it has to support that feature correctly. So if it indicates support for that feature, we're going to perform that test, and the device must pass that test in order to qualify for the integrators list. If the option is not supported, then the test isn't applicable. We don't perform it. You don't have to worry about it. So that's what we mean when we say optional test. It's tests for features that are optional according to the NVMe specification. And I'll have an example of that a little bit later on. And then finally, there's FYI tests, or your information tests. Sometimes we'll call them experimental tests. Again, these tests do not affect a device's qualification for the integrators list. There are means of collecting information about how to perform a test, what kind of feature support we're seeing among devices, and they may become mandatory in the future. So if you attended the last couple Plugfests, you probably noticed at Plugfest 3, we had two tests, the boot test, which was an interoperability test where we booted off of an NVMe SSD, and a hot plug test as well. Those were FYI tests last time. They've become mandatory for some devices, depending on form factor. So when you see that a test is labeled FYI, know that it doesn't affect integrators list qualification today, but it may affect it in the future. So we'd like to encourage people to, if you see those in your test schedule, please be sure to go through those test stations and get those FYI tests done. It helps us determine if it's feasible to do these tests in the future, if there's proper support for it, and also if we're doing the tests correctly. So that's what the FYI tests are about. So now with respect to the Plugfest, I'm going to go into a little more detail on the interop tests. If you were to go to the website and download the interop test suite for NVMe, you'd see that there's 6 tests in there, 6 required tests. One is installing an SSD in a system and identifying it in the OS. One is formatting the drive. One is running a write, read, and compare test on the device. This is the one we use VDBench for. And so I've got a little bit more information about VDBench in a few slides. But this is the one that probably takes the most time because we do several shutdown and reboot cycles on the drive and run VDBench again. Finally, multiple devices on the bus. This is the test that requires that we have 2 of your samples plugged into the NVMe host platform. And in practice, typically what we'll do is, even in test 1.1, the very first test, we'll plug in 2 devices. And we'll run all of these tests with 2 devices plugged in. Finally, the boot test, test 1.5, we'll actually use a UEFI to boot up and install an operating system on the NVMe SSD, and then boot off that. The operating system we'll most likely use is Windows 8.1, although other operating systems could be used if you so choose. And then the hot plug test. This test applies only to SFF 8639 devices. So we're going to go through all of the different combinations of SSDs and host platforms that are present at the event, and we'll do these tests on them. Tests 1 through 4 will do all SSD and host combinations. Tests 1.5 and 1.6, we have specific hosts that are earmarked just for the boot test and just for the hot plug test. And you'll see that on my next slide. So this slide addresses another thing we get a lot of questions about: what hosts are we going to test against at the event, and then also what operating systems. So you see here on the left, these are the hosts that we'll have set up at the event. So at least these 9 hosts. There may be some host companies that are going to attend and bring other systems. So, but at least these 9 should be available. In the middle, the operating system that's available on each of those hosts. You'll see some of them are TBD, specifically those 2 ASUS systems. If you have special requests, we'd be willing to hear those before we actually go ahead and install the operating system on those. For one of those, I'm likely going to put a version of Linux that has the 4.0 kernel on it. And the reason for that is that the NVMe driver in the 4.0 kernel is a little bit different. It's updated from the NVMe driver that's in the kernel that's used in Red Hat and Ubuntu and so forth. So we're going to try and get a system there that's using the latest available NVMe driver for the Linux kernel. Then on the far right in this table, the tests that we're intending to use it for. You'll see those Dell PowerEdge systems, older systems but reliable, and we understand their behavior very well. So that's why we've tagged those ones for using for hot plug and the boot test. We've run those tests successfully on those systems with several drives in the past, so that's why we're going to continue to rely on those. All the other systems were available for the write, read, and verify test. So if you want to take a screenshot of this page, I'll leave it up there for a second, but of course we're going to make sure that these slides are available after today's webinar as well. This is a common question though, which systems are we going to test against? At least these ones in this table. Now I've been talking a little bit about that VDBench test tool. Maybe you've used it back in your own lab. It's a pretty commonly used tool. We chose it because it works well on Linux-based and Windows-based systems, and it's a free download. Here's the link for that download. It's created by Oracle, and they still make it available. So you can download the tool at this link, and then the 2 links at the bottom are the parameter files that we're going to use at the Plugfest and that we use in our interoperability testing day-to-day here at UNH-IOL. So with that free download and with the 2 parameter files that are linked to at the bottom, they're slightly different, one's for Linux, one's for Windows. You can perform a big chunk of the interoperability testing in your own lab. So that's why we make that available. So it should be very easy for you to duplicate what we're going to be doing at the Plugfest. Now the only interop tool that is not freely available is the Quarktorion Tool. And again, a lot of you are probably familiar with this tool. Pretty clever item here. It's a little interposer card that can sit between a SFF8639 drive and an SFF8639 midplane in a server. And what you can do with this tool is break the link so that we can actually perform these hot plug tests in a consistent fashion. So one of the difficult things in performing a hot plug test is, if you have a human removing and reinserting the drive, every cycle is going to be a little bit different. And so we use this Quarktorion tool to add some consistency to that, to know that the drive is being removed and reinserted in the same way each time. For now, we're really only kind of scratching the surface of the capabilities of this tool. I'm hoping that in the future we'll be adding new test cases here where we'll do fast removes and slow removes and fast adds and slow adds. But for today, we're just going to be doing 1 speed. So we'll be using this tool at the event. Again, a note on the hot plug test, it's only required for SFF8639 drives. It's not required for add-in cards, it's not required for M.2 cards, not required for hosts either, just SFF8639 drives. And another note about the hot plug, that's going to be an orderly remove and an orderly add. There's not going to be a surprise remove and a surprise add for that test today. We may add that in the future, but for now, just an orderly remove, orderly add. What I mean by that is that actually through the operating system, we'll notify the system that a drive is about to be removed. Disable the drive in the operating system, then use the Quark tool to actually break the link to simulate the drive being removed. Then use the Quark tool to add it back in, notify the operating system of that. So no surprise tests here. It'll all be orderly hot plug. So nice table outlining what is required tests for Plugfest number 4. I outlined this a little bit earlier, but here's a nice table with all that information. You'll see those 2 tests with the new badge, the boot test and the hot plug test. Those were former FYI tests. Now they are requirements for the NVMe integrators list. And there's one test there at the bottom, test 1.7, for dual port devices. That is an experimental FYI test. We're going to have some, hopefully, dual port capable devices there at the event. And the version of the NVMe driver that is in the Linux 4.0 kernel does support dual port devices. So we're going to be doing some experiments with that. And from what we learn in those tests, we'll be refining that test. So if you do have any kind of dual port capability, we'd very much like to try out some of these tests on it. And again, purely FYI test, experimental, does not affect integrators list qualification today. So that's it as regards the details on the interoperability tests. For more details, I'd suggest you look at the interoperability test suite. The procedures there are pretty well defined. If you have questions about them, of course, feel free to contact us directly. So with that, I'm going to move on to the conformance tests. In a nutshell, the conformance tests are going to use a host emulator to exercise and stimulate the SSD. And it's going to perform a number of admin commands, NVM commands, and check various controller registers. The NVMe Conformance Test Suite is available on the same page as the Interoperability Test Suite. So, what tests do you have to pass on the conformance side? Well, all of the mandatory conformance tests that are supported by the test tools. Unless there's an optional test. So if you have an optional feature that is not supported, then we won't perform that test. If you do support it, we will perform it, and the device must pass that test. So I've got an example of that here, just to make that a little bit clearer, even though we did talk about it earlier. The write zeros command in the NVMe specification, this is an optional command, and support for that command is indicated in the ONCS field, or the optional NVM command support field in your identify. So if the DUT indicates that it supports the write zeros command in this ONCS field, we're going to perform the test, and the device must pass the test. It has to be able to complete that write zeros command successfully. If that bit is set to 0 and the device does not support the write zeros command, we just skip the test, and it has no effect on the integrators list qualification. So I hope that clears up some of the questions about optional versus mandatory tests. And as you look through the test suite, you'll see that there's notes for certain tests that are optional versus mandatory. And in fact, I've got a table later on here that's going to show that in even a little more detail. One question that we get a lot for the Plugfest is there a required NVMe revision that we have to support? So your device is going to indicate which revision of the NVMe specification it supports, 1, 1.1, 1.2, etc. We do not consider the revision of the revision of the NVMe specification that the device is reporting. We do not consider that to be a required part of this program. So it's not like we're going to look at a device and say, oh, it's supporting 1.1, fail. No, that's not what we're doing. The device can indicate support for any NVMe revision. What we're looking for is that the device supports all of the tests that are required in the current NVMe Conformance Test Suite. So don't worry too much if your device is advertising a different revision support for the NVMe specification. That's not what we're looking for. The reason this question sometimes comes up, an earlier version of one of our test tools was flagging a failure depending on which NVMe revision a device was indicating support for. That's a bug that we've fixed, and I'll have a little information on that, just a few more slides. So what do we actually use to perform those conformance tests? We have two test tools, the IOL Interact PC edition and the IOL Interact Teledynelecroy edition. First, the PC edition. This is a test tool that runs on any Linux-based system. We recommend people use Ubuntu 14.04. That's the one we have the most experience with. It's based on top of TNVMe. So you might remember earlier I mentioned TNVMe as a publicly available open source test tool, and UNH-IOL is the admin for that. So you know, all the community support for UNH-IOL's NVMe Test Consortium does a couple things. It makes these test tools available to members, but it also makes that TNVMe test tool available to the whole world. And a lot of people have taken that and built on top of that and expanded on that. So this PC edition of our tool builds on top of that TNVMe project. We just released the newest version of that, version 1.2.0. That was released just a couple weeks ago, April 24th. And this fixed that issue that we had with marking early revisions of the NVMe spec as a failure. So you won't see that bug anymore. As far as the number of tests that this particular test tool is able to perform, it does most of the required conformance tests. I've got a table later on that shows you the differences between what tests this tool can do versus the Lacroix tool. And so that's the next one, the IOL Interact Teledynelecroy edition. In order to use this test tool, you need to have the Teledynelecroy Z3 exerciser and analyzer, as well as Windows PC. Currently, we're using software build 7.2.0. I'm sorry, 7.20, 7.20 is the software version, the Lacroix PE Tracer software version that we're using. We're going to try and upgrade that to 7.34 by the time of the Plugfest, but I don't believe that will be a released version. So we're going to ensure that if there are any unexpected failures, that we'll run it with both to make sure that we're not introducing any failures by using that newer version. Now, some folks might wonder, why do we have two conformance tools? There seems like there's some overlap here. You've got the PC edition, you've got the Lacroix edition. Why is that? Well, basically what it boils down to is the PC edition, there's a relatively low barrier to entry there. All you need is a PC running Ubuntu, and you've got a pretty versatile NVMe test system. Obviously, with the Lacroix system, there's some hardware and there's some expense in obtaining that hardware, but there's also a great deal of capability that you get by having that hardware available. So on the PC edition, essentially we're restricted to operating kind of at the driver level, and we can't actually see what's happening on the PCIe bus. With the Lacroix tool, we can actually capture bus traces of what's happening on the PCIe bus, and that adds a great deal of debug capability. So there's a trade-off there. We've got a cheaper tool that doesn't have as much debug capability, more expensive tool that obviously gives you trace analysis and log files and all kinds of other capabilities. So we think that there's a need for both of those in the community. And we've done a fair amount of work here at UNH-IOL to ensure that we get similar results out of both of those tools. So here's a table I was referring to earlier, so you can see which tests are performed by which tool. And we're going to have both of these tools up and running at the event. All of the devices that come to the event are going to be cycled through both of these conformance test stations. So you can see on the IOL Interact side, or IOL Interact PC edition side, there's a couple tests that we don't perform. So we don't perform the abort command test. We don't perform the write zeros test. In group 3, we don't perform tests 3.2 and 3.3. And then we don't do any of the group 6 tests. Those are the tests that have to do with resetting the device. On the Lacroix edition side, all group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are supported. There's one test in group 6 that isn't supported. Since there is no tool that performs that test has no impact on integrators list qualification. If in the future we find a way to do that with our tools, it would become a requirement, but for today, not a requirement. So this table just helps you understand kind of the support differences between those two tools. Now, what tests are required? Earlier we said all of the tests have to be performed, all of them, it's mandatory to pass all of the required tests. Well, which ones are required? In group 1, all the tests are mandatory. Every device has to support those tests in order to, every device has to pass those tests in order to get onto the NVMe integrators list. In group 2, there's some tests that are optional, and I alluded to the write zeros test before. All these tests that are optional on the right-hand side there in group 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.5, and 2.7. For those tests, a device indicates support in the ONCS field. So if the field is all zeros, those tests simply aren't performed. And then you'll see there's a couple other optional tests in group 3 and group 4. And then finally, group 6. Test 6.4 is an optional test. This is the test for NVMe subsystem reset. And so I draw attention to that one. I've seen a couple cases where devices will indicate support for NVMe subsystem reset unintentionally. They'll set that bit to 1, and then we'll try and perform the reset, and no reset will occur. That's the most common type of failure there. So just make sure that if you're expecting to support that, obviously set it to 1. If you're not expecting to support that, make sure you set that bit to 0 so that we don't inadvertently perform that test. So those are the interop and conformance tests. Those are the ones that have bearing on whether a device qualifies for the integrators list. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the FYI tests, or the experimental tests. Now, those conformance test stations that I outlined, the IOL Interact PC edition and IOL Interact LaCroix edition, they'll perform all the required tests at those stations, but they also might perform some of these FYI tests. Now, these are tests that are under development, and that's why I say they may perform them. Because of time, these will be the tests that we leave to the end. And then also because of feature support, these tests might not be performed. But I'm sharing this here to give you an idea of what kinds of things, what kinds of tests might be required in the future, and what kind of features the NVMe community has expressed interest in adding to this integrators list program. So on the conformance side, automatic power state transitions is something that NVMe community has expressed interest in testing. We're going to not test power consumption. These tests aren't going to be looking at power consumption. They're going to be looking at the state machine for automatic power state transitions. So we're hoping to have a couple of those developed and try and run them on an experimental basis at this upcoming Plugfest. The other side is dual port tests and reservations. So we've defined a couple experimental tests for those as well. On the interop side, also dual port and reservations, checking interoperability there is going to be an FYI test, something that may be added in the future. And then the PCIe switch and retimer test. This is a new one, and this is something that we're adding, hopefully adding, to the Plugfest and the Integrators List program in the near future. So I've got a little bit more detail about that a few slides ahead. But again, these are experimental tests. These are things that we're doing in a forward-looking fashion, trying to collect data on what things we can add to the interop program, or the Integrators List program in the future, and again, improve the overall quality of the program. Another FYI test station that will be available is the PHY test station. There will be a test station set up that's going to be doing a PCIe electrical test. We're going to be following the PCIe SIG procedures, following the MOIs that they've published, but this is not PCIe SIG testing. You won't be able to qualify a device for PCIe SIG integrators list through this. This is just, we're using their methods. And the purpose of doing this is, given that there's new form factors here, M.2 and 8639, we're trying to just kind of provide a value add here, help people go through that electrical testing with these new form factors and see if there's anything that they need to tune in order to meet the PCIe electrical requirements. Again, not part of the NVMe integrators list. You can consider this a formal experimental FYI test. Additionally, there may be other protocol test companies that come to the event. A lot of them find a lot of value in getting to see their customers at the event, run their tools against a bunch of different devices. But if it's not a UNH-IOL test station, you can consider that FYI. So they may have other test capability that they want to show off, run experiments on, and that's great. We'd encourage them to do that. We'd encourage you to make sure that you go through each of those test stations if they're on your test schedule. But again, FYI, not part of the Integrators List program, but certainly a great deal of value from an informative test perspective. So we encourage that. And then finally, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, this PCIe switch and retimer test station. So if we look at the designs for servers that are implementing NVMe, servers that are designed to have lots of PCIe flash storage in them, a lot of times they'll use a PCIe switch or PCIe retimer in order to properly route and get good signal integrity throughout the box. So these devices are important components in a NVMe system. They may not be NVMe aware, but they're an important part of the system. So we're going to have some of these switch and retimer companies attending the event, and we're going to have a station set up where we can run the interop tests, the ones that I described before, the write, read, and verify, perhaps even the boot test and hot plug test. Have those set up, but instead of running them directly against the host, you'll be running them with a PCIe switch or retimer in line. And essentially, nothing should be any different. If those switches and retimers are doing their job and doing it well, you won't see any different. And so this is something that we're looking at adding to the Integrators List program possibly in the future. So again, this is an FYI test. Now, in order to make this possible, we're going to be adding, UNH-IOL is going to be adding a PCIe connectivity membership to our NVMe consortium. So today, all of the companies that are members of our consortium here at UNH-IOL are full members, and so they get access to all of the services and all of the software and all of the events that we do as part of consortium activities. For the switch and retimer folks, they're primarily interested in interoperability testing. They're not particularly interested in NVMe conformance testing. They're not particularly interested in NVMe conformance test tools, but they are interested in NVMe interoperability testing. So in order to help them attend this Plugfest and also participate in future interoperability testing at UNH-IOL, we are opening up a PCIe connectivity membership in our NVMe consortium. That's going to allow access to particular interoperability test services that we offer. So this is a very new thing, something that's coming together in the last couple weeks. So if you've got further questions about that, I guess you could put a question in the chat if you are particularly interested in it, or contact us directly. There's going to be further information about how to join UNH-IOL as a PCIe connectivity member, hopefully in the next few days, and that'll show up on our website. So now a little bit of information about the logistics, registering for the event, what the schedule for the event should be, who should be coming to the event, that sort of thing. So first off, registration is currently open. It's open to all UNH-IOL NVMe Consortium members and also these new PCIe connectivity members. Here is the link to the registration page. And it's just typical registration page, getting name and contact info, what kind of device you're going to bring, and that sort of thing. I'm also providing a link here for a membership at UNH-IOL if your company hasn't completed that paperwork yet. Registration is going to close on May 15th. Registration is going to close on May 15th, so please pay attention to that. That's just next week. Registration is going to close for the event. Now, who should attend? Companies that are implementing NVMe products, companies that are going to be supporting NVMe products in their systems, so OEMs that are hoping to use NVMe drives and so forth. And products that are coming to the event, sometimes people say, hey, I've got a very early product, should I bring it? Essentially, if the product is at a point where I can plug it into a system and it can be recognized as a storage device with just a common Windows or Linux NVMe driver, then it's in a state where it can come to the event and get a lot of value from the testing at the event. It doesn't necessarily have to be passing all of the conformance tests or all of the interoperability tests in order to get value out of the event. But it does need to be at this point where, standard available drivers can identify the device as an NVMe storage device. So keep that in mind. And then finally, if your company is still maybe developing a product that is maybe in stealth mode or hasn't been announced or whatnot, and you don't want to actually bring a device to the event, there's not a lot of value in coming to the event. It's a testing-focused event. We're going to be moving devices through all the various test stations and collecting data. And if you don't have a device, there's really not a lot of value in coming to the event. So that's something we really discourage. So we don't really have a provision for people just to attend as observers or anything like that. Other questions that we sometimes get that I neglected to address on this slide, sometimes people ask, what types of engineers should they send to the event? I've got a software engineer, I've got a hardware engineer, who should go? The best thing I can say there is ahead of the event, try and run some of these tests in your own lab and see what kind of hiccups that you get and who's having to solve them. So if you're needing to call your hardware engineer while you're setting this up in your own lab, he might be a good candidate to send to an event like this. A lot of times there's needs to do firmware updates as bugs are discovered. So make sure that the folks that you're sending to the event, the staff and the engineers that you're sending to the event to support your product, have that capability that they can actually perform a firmware update. Even if they have to send the failure back home to their own lab and have someone actually update or create the new firmware, write the new firmware, do the bug fix, just make sure that the team on hand has the ability to do a firmware update on the product. Now, as I said, registration is going to close on May 15th, and we're going to be putting the schedule out May 18th, or the week of May 18th. So a lot of folks are asking, hey, what days do I need to be there? What devices am I going to test against which day? We'll be releasing that schedule the week of May 18th, and you'll see exactly how and when your device is scheduled for the event. So that schedule is going to be based on who registers. So please, if you're not doing anything after this webinar, go to our registration page and be sure to register your product. If you register late, that one of two things will happen. Either we will not accept your registration, or it's going to cause problems for myself in the schedule and the other people that are attending the event, because a late registration may mean that we need to move things around. People may have already made travel plans based on the schedule they saw. So please don't register late. It'll just make it easier for everyone. During the event, UNH-IOL staff is going to be collecting the test data from the conformance test stations and from the interop test stations. And we're going to be collecting all of that in order to create our test reports. So after the event, you will get a test report on each device that you have brought to the event. The conformance test report will outline the conformance results from both the PC edition and LaCroix edition of our conformance test tools. And then also you will get an interoperability report that defines the test results for your SSD and each of the host platforms that you tested against, or vice versa. If you've brought a host platform, it'll show all the SSDs that you were able to test against. Those test reports do two things. One, they're kind of the gateway document for putting a product on the integrators list. So once that report is complete and it indicates all of the necessary tests are passing, then your device qualifies for the integrators list. If we don't have the data for the report, we can't create the report. We can't put a device on the integrators list. So pay attention to that throughout the week. Obviously, myself and the other staff here at UNH-IOL are going to be doing everything we can to make sure that we're collecting all of the data. But please make sure that none of that data kind of slips through the cracks, as it were. Make sure that we're collecting everything. And if you need to check in with us every day and say, hey, did you get this logged? Does it look like we're going to qualify? That's fine. You're not going to upset us. We understand it's a high priority item. So please pay attention to that. So the reports are what's going to ultimately get you on the integrators list. Also, those reports become your company's property. You can share them with any of your partners or customers to show, yes, we are conformant to the NVMe specification. Yes, we are interoperable with these systems, and we've proved it in this public setting at the NVMe Plugfest. So finally, a little bit about listing products. Here's the link to the product registry page, or integrators list page, I'm sorry, that we looked at before. Make sure you look at the 1.2 policy. That's the one that outlines all the current requirements. I did an overview of those requirements here today, but this document actually goes into a fair amount of detail about those things. The report that you get from UNH-IOL will indicate whether a product is eligible or not. We don't just list the products automatically. We expect to get a request from you in email that you would like to see the product listed, and that you provide all the appropriate information about that product. For example, its name, product type, firmware revision, things like that. So here's the list of things that we would need from you in order to list the product on the integrators list. And this is actually information that would go onto the integrators list and what would be shared about the product. Sometimes folks ask about listing similar products. Hey, I've got 5 versions of this SSD and they're all different capacities. Do I need to test all of them? No. If there's just differences that don't affect NVMe operation, for example, the capacity or the form factor, we don't need to test it again. However, if there's NVMe differences, for example, one device supports an optional feature and another doesn't, then yes, we would need to run the tests and list them separately. But if the only difference is size, the only difference is capacity, we can perform the test once and then on the integrators list it multiple times. So finally, testing after the Plugfest. As I said earlier, this Plugfest is the first opportunity to test against these new requirements, but from June 12th onward, we'll be testing against those requirements here at UNH-IOL week in and week out. So if you have updates to products, new firmware, if you're not able to attend the Plugfest, don't stress too much. You can schedule time at UNH-IOL to do that testing. Here's the link for your login to a UNH-IOL site so you can actually schedule that testing. And the reason I kind of highlight that even a little more this time is the next NVMe Plugfest is another year out. Plugfest number 5 is currently scheduled for June 6, 2016. So if you're hoping to attend a Plugfest in late 2015, it's not going to happen. There's none scheduled. So if you wanted to put a device on the integrators list during that time, late 2015, early 2016, you just have to send it through UNH-IOL Lab. But all of that is included in the membership here. So just a quick recap of the things our consortium provides, the test services week in and week out throughout the year. The Plugfest that we're excited is coming up June 8th. Access to our test tools so you can duplicate our setup in your lab at home. The ability to list products on the integrators list, the ability to put products in our interop test bed, and then finally support for that open source NVMe tool. So this test program that we've put together, as I highlighted earlier, it's focused on the integrators list. All of the test plans, some of those parameter files, the request for downloading software, adding products to our test bed, all those things can be done via the UNH-IOL website. And of course, the testing will continue after the Plugfest. Here's a couple links that you may find useful: the membership form, registration form, our test suites, and the policy document for the integrators list. That is everything that I had to share. We're took a little longer than I expected, but we do have some time for Q&A, so I'll hand it over to Carrie for a few minutes.
All right, thank you, David. We do have one question. For conformance testing with LaCroix tools, Windows platform you use would be 64-bit only or 32-bit also?
That's a good question. I think we only use 64-bit at this point. Yeah, Windows 7 64-bit or Windows 8 64-bit are the systems that we've used here at the lab. Yeah, so I would recommend 64. I'm not going to say 32 won't work. I'm just saying we've got the most time using 64-bit. Good question.
All right, that's actually the only question we have. That concludes today's webinar. The webinar will be available shortly. I will be sending out a link to that. Thank you all for joining us, and please contact David or myself if you have any further questions or comments.
All right, thank you very much, Carrie. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.